is WEIN1. On Twitter is where you can find me on social media. We are back post week 7 in college football to recap all of the marquee games from yesterday, give you our takeaways from the demolition that the Longhorns gave the Oklahoma Sooners to send them back across the border. Very, very unhappy. And a lot of other stuff happened yesterday in college football as well. It was a great week with multiple thrilling finishes, including one in Eugene, Oregon, between the two favorites in the Big Ten. The Oregon Ducks slide past the Ohio State Buckeyes, 32 to 31. We'll get into that as well. And then on the back half of today's show, we will be continuing to talk about college basketball, as we are now 22 days away from the tip-off of college basketball in 2024. Make sure you like and subscribe. Check out all of our content over on our YouTube channel under the live section. It helps our algorithm and it supports us. It's free of charge. Check out our Patreon, which is also free of charge. We put episodes on our Patreon pretty infrequently at this time, but at least once a month we'll do something over there. And then you can also find us wherever you listen to your podcast. So, with all that being said, before we get into everything here tonight, I have to welcome in my co-host, as always, Mr. Irby Nixon. What is up, man?
I'm doing great. Great intro as always. One thing I do want to add too is we record, well, our normal recording schedule is Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. So if you want to be in our live shows on YouTube, we're usually live on those nights around this time. So definitely, if you want to be a part of this, definitely subscribe.
Absolutely. We greatly appreciate that. All right, let's waste no time and get into talking some football. We obviously had the NFL today. If you're not familiar with our schedule, we'll be recapping the NFL with our post-Week 6 power rankings on Tuesday night. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about what happened yesterday in college football. And since this is deep in the heart of Longhorn sports, let's just go ahead and start with your Texas Longhorns, the number 1 team in the country, once again, as the AP poll was released this afternoon, who took care of business in Dallas at the Cotton Bowl, 34-3, after somewhat of a slow start, with Quinn Ewers back at quarterback, and beat the Oklahoma Sooners in the Cotton Bowl for the second time in 3 years by 30 or more points. So, Emmy, let's start on the Texas side of things, because we always start with the winners. What were your main takeaways from yesterday's game?
Well, I thought the overall flow of the game was interesting. I think both teams kind of started out, well, especially Texas. I think Texas kind of started off a little bit almost nonchalant with how they came out. I'm not going to say they came out flat. Definitely the defense didn't come out flat, but there was definitely a lack of attention to detail when it comes to the offensive side of the football in that first quarter. And I think that's just the sign of Texas knowing that they were the better football team from the get-go. And that was shown throughout the game. But I think the interesting note to take away from this was this rust from Quinn Ewers, obviously being out for a month. That plays a part in it, of course. But to me, it almost looked like more nerves, because sometimes you kind of got to get into the flow of the game to kind of settle down, and that's usually how it typically goes in these big games. But with Quinn in the big games, it seems like he's always came out hot, and I think that's what Texas fans have become accustomed to. And with this game, I think he did have some nerves. I think, obviously, this is a big legacy game for Quinn Ewers. He didn't want to go 1-2 against Oklahoma in his career at Texas. So, I think that's the biggest takeaway for me is I don't think what we saw from Quinn Ewers in that first quarter is something we're going to see again later on in the year or something that's to be worried about. I think it's just more so just nerves in that particular game in that environment, being the Red River rivalry.
Yes. Number one, I will say yesterday was not a good game from Quinn Ewers. He picked it up in the second quarter, where I think he had a 180 quarterback rating. Texas scores 21 points in the second quarter. He was good in the second quarter. He had one great quarter, which is usually when Quinn doesn't have his best games. That's usually what we'll see. Like, he'll have a good quarter. He'll have, some inconsistency throughout, but he'll have a great quarter. He'll play really well for a quarter, and then he won't play so well for some of the other, quarters. And yesterday in the first quarter, and I think overall just throughout the game, and I don't know what it was. Could have been nerves. Could have been rust. Maybe it was a combination of both. It just felt like he was jittery in the pocket. I don't know why. It didn't feel like Oklahoma, aside from the first play of the game when they did get a sack, was getting like an overwhelming amount of pressure. I felt the Texas offensive line did a really good job for most of the game, keeping him upright. But it just didn't feel right with Quinn Ewers yesterday. And that's okay, because maybe what we're learning with this Texas team is that they don't need great quarterback play every Saturday to win with what this defense is showing us so far. Let's talk about the defense. Because that, to me, even more so than the offense, halfway through the season, is the story of this team so far. I saw a tweet earlier, and I'm trying to find it, with Texas's defensive rankings in the country. And I will get to it eventually. Here we are. Texas ranks number 1, and this should be a paper popper, but I didn't write it down, so can't do that. Opponent points per game, 6.3 allowed. That's number 1 in the country. Opponent yards per game, 229.7. That's number 1 in the country. Opponent yards per play. They're allowing less than 4 opponent yards per play so far this season, 3.7. They gave up 3.43 yards per play yesterday to Oklahoma, which is the exact same amount of yards per play that they gave up to Colorado State, who they beat 52-0. That puts it into context for you, both the ineptitude of the Oklahoma offense and just how good this Texas defense is. That's number 1 in the country. Third down conversion percentage against this Texas defense. They're giving up 27.6% of opponent third downs. That's 7th in the country. Explosive plays of 20-plus yards. They've given up 9 so far this season. That is number 1 in the country, and it's not close. Opponent yards per pass, 4.6. That's number 1 in the country. Opponent pass yards per game, 126. That's number 2 in the country. And opponent 20-yard pass plays. They've given up 8 of those. That's number 1 in the country. And they're also number 12 in the country in opponent rush yards. Yards per rush. Less than 3 yards per rush. So overall, this Texas defense, top to bottom, is playing really good football. And we all know what the response to that from non-Texas fans is. Who have they played? Well, it's been a mixed bag, especially at the quarterback position. They have not faced a great quarterback yet. They're going to play Georgia this weekend, and so we're going to find out a lot more about just how good this Texas team is, because Carson Beck will far and away be the best quarterback that they've played so far. I don't think Carson Beck is great, but he's really good. And so we're going to find out more, but all we can go off of is what we've seen so far. And to a certain extent, last year, Texas played some bad offenses, and they made them look better than they should have. This year, they're playing, you can say, less than average or below average teams, but they're making them look that way. And that's what great teams do. So you got to give the collective coaching staff, Pete Kwiatkowski, all the way down, credit for their game plan against Oklahoma yesterday. And then there are some individual standout players that I do want to get into. So, Emmy, if you were to give out 3 game balls from yesterday's game, who would you give them to?
Well, I got to start with Anthony Hill. I mean, obviously, you could give the guy a game ball every week if you really wanted to, but my goodness, the dude was just everywhere, man. Like I don't even know how other way to what other way to say it, man. Like that was maybe the best linebacker performance I've seen in a college game in quite a while. Like that was insane. Um, Against a running quarterback where he knew he was going to be a big part of what Texas brought to the table defensively in this game because he was going to be the guy spying, he was going to be the guy having to fly around, and he did all of it. Second, I mean, might be a kind of a cop out, but the offensive line, man, that that performance, I think, was what we expected out of this unit coming into the year. And that's not to say, like, they haven't met expectations so far. They have. It just hasn't been perfect. I think the penalties were cleaned up for the most part. I think the push in the run game was downright dominant. And that's what impressed me the most. They were 5-6 yards down the field on every single run play, it felt like. And making it really easy on these backs to be able to break free into the second level and then do what they do and use their ability and use why they came to the University of Texas. So that's the first two things. Third game ball, I mean, there's a lot of guys that played well in this game. It's hard for me to even I'd be interested to hear what you say on the third guy, but I'm sure we're kind of on the same page with those first two.
Well, I'm definitely on the same page with you on Anthony Hill Jr. There was a former Oklahoma player this past week. His name is Game Icard. I think it's Ikard. I think it's the OU Insider podcast or something along those lines, who pinpointed Anthony Hill as one of the weak points of the Texas defense, which was, number one, just laughable. But I think what he saw the Mississippi State game. He watched the Mississippi State game where Anthony Hill missed 4 tackles and thought, maybe Oklahoma can, with Hawkins, who's a mobile quarterback, can run at him. But what they don't realize was that was kind of a off game from a Texas run defense perspective. They weren't backfilling the run with those linebackers, the greatest that they have so far this season. That wasn't up to Texas defense standards. And look, Anthony Hill and David Benda overall did not play to standard against Mississippi State, against the run at least. But whatever that guy said, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is Anthony Hill is going to be an All-American. And if he's not, I will do bad things on this podcast. But yesterday, 11 tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss, which is a career high for him, 4 quarterback pressures, 2 sacks, and a forced fumble. All over the place. So absolutely, he gets the game ball. He was the best player on the Texas defense yesterday. And, the Texas defense overall as a unit played really well, but he was the standout. Absolutely. I think the offensive line played well, but I'm not giving them a game ball because I think there are other guys who deserve it individually. I think you have to give a big shout out, number one, to Trey Wisner, who, if we're being honest, and I know there were a ton of Jaden Blue supporters to start the year, and I was one of them, especially when C.J. Baxter went down with the leg injury. But Trey Wisner looks like the best running back in this running back room right now. And that's a fact. over 100 yards rushing yesterday and was effective on all his carries. The one mishap he had was the almost costly fumble where he fumbled and the ball rolled into the end zone and Silas Bolden eventually recovered it. But overall, like, when he got his opportunity yesterday, he took advantage of it. He was breaking tackles, making the most out of every single run, running hard, scored a touchdown on another long run to put them up 21-3. Great performance from Trey Wisner. Let's just make sure, and I'll continue to say it until it doesn't happen. These Texas running backs gotta hold on to the ball. It's not going to cost you against Oklahoma's offense. It's not going to cost you against who you've played so far. But in a game like this weekend against Georgia, one fumble can cost you the game. Got to hold on to the football. And again, like, a loss this weekend to Georgia wouldn't be costly, but you get what I'm saying. And then two other players on offense I think deserve, if not game balls, they deserve a ton of credit for what they did yesterday. Number one's Gunnar Hill, who just continues to be an absolute stud for this Texas team. Scored a touchdown yesterday. I don't know his exact stat line, but he's a playmaker, and he's very underrated. And I don't know how. I know it's really early on in the draft process, but ESPN has him as their 9th best tight end in next year's draft. Like, I don't really understand that. He's a top 5 tight end in next year's draft. Like, he just is. Just watch him play the game of football. And then Silas Bolden probably made the play of the game yesterday. Wisner breaks off that long run. Ultimately gets the ball punched at it like the 4-yard line. It rolls into the back left corner of the end zone. And Silas Bolden runs 55 yards all the way full speed to the back corner of the end zone. Has the wherewithal and the football IQ to know, like, I got to go get that football once it's popped out. And at full speed, stops his body and recovers the ball just before it's about to roll out the back of the end zone, which would have been a turnover on downs. With Texas about to score a touchdown, that game would have still been 7-3. Now, ultimately, Texas probably could have won this game 7-3 because OU's offense is just that inept. But that was Jordan Whittington stuff right there. That was the hustle, the heart plays that make championship football teams. And Silas Bolden, what did I say in the last episode? I wanted to see him play better. And I wanted to see him step up. And he did that yesterday because he also made impact on special teams. He was great on punt return yesterday. Had a 64-yard punt return to set up Texas in great field position. And he probably saved Texas another 20 or 30 yards of field position with some of the catches and plays that he made on punt return yesterday. So great job to Silas Bolden. Great job Trey Reisner. Great job Gunnar Helm. And great job Anthony Hill. 4 game balls yesterday. Those would be my 4. Along with, everyone else. Like, nobody played bad. And ultimately, I don't worry about Quinn Ewers. You just have to play better against Georgia. If he plays like that against Georgia, Texas cannot win next week. They just can't. But we will see what happens. Is that about it, though? From a Texas standpoint, let's just real quick. Where does Oklahoma go from here?
Oof. That's a loaded question. I think. I don't think this true freshman quarterback is ready for a SEC slate. I really don't. Some of the mechanics of his throwing were just really funky yesterday. Like he was throwing the out route to the left, and his feet were like pretzeled, and he just straight sailed it. Little things like that, like, you just can't have that. When you get an open pass like that, you can't miss the layups, especially in the SEC. So, I don't know. if it were me, I would go back to Jackson Arnold. I know Jackson Arnold didn't look great, but I think it gives you a higher ceiling in terms of a passing offense. So I think that's where you go if you're Oklahoma.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's pretty unacceptable for an Oklahoma program in year 3 under Brenton Venables to look this inept on offense. They were so bad yesterday. I don't have the drive chart pulled up in front of me, but I know this. 11 drives that Oklahoma had yesterday went for 20 yards or less. Their longest play of the day was 13 yards. 13 yards, 0 plays, 0 explosive plays. I know it's against a pretty tough Texas defense, but I don't even blame the Hawkins kid. Like, that kid did everything he could.
Yeah,
They asked him to drop back. They asked him to drop back 42 times. Why are you asking a true freshman quarterback to drop back against a horrible, horrible offensive line in a game against the number 1 team in the country, the number 1 defense in the country? It makes 0 sense to me. I don't even know that they called a design run yesterday for Hawkins. Maybe a couple. It just was bad all around. Seth Luttrell needs to go for Oklahoma. That hire at offensive coordinator has totally failed. I don't know that at this point you can go back to Jackson Arnold, because I think Jackson Arnold's confidence is killed, and I think he personally, and I don't blame him for this, is mentally checked out. I think that kid's like, he's got one foot in the portal already. And I think if you're Oklahoma, Michael Hawkins is probably all you have in the short term. Maybe you try out Casey Thompson, because at least he's a veteran. You could go to Casey Thompson. But I think the fact that they didn't go back to Jackson Arnold.
Like the same Casey Thompson from like...
Yes, same Casey Thompson from Nebraska, same Casey Thompson from Texas. The fact that they didn't go to either of those guys yesterday, I don't know. A lot of Oklahoma.
That says a lot about those quarterbacks, though.
Too. Yeah, I do too. A lot of Oklahoma fans, and this is the last thing I'll say, want Venables to be fired. And I don't think it's going to happen after this season. But if this keeps going at the rate that it is, and it's going in this direction and not this direction, it's not even going like in this direction. It's not even going sideways. Like, the train is going off the tracks, way off the tracks at this point. He's got to go into the portal. He's got to find the right quarterback. He's got to rework his offensive coaching staff. He needs to get a good offensive coordinator, because next year I think will be the year that he's going to be under a lot of pressure to win. Because you can't fall this far behind in this conference. May have been okay in the Big 12, but in the SEC, this isn't going to cut it. So they got to go into the portal. They got to find a quarterback. They got to find a way to put together an offensive line that can hold up for a quarter, much less a game. Their defense, I think, will be good. Like, at least that's a solid part of the team, and that's where Venables prides himself, obviously, as a former defensive coordinator. But if this doesn't improve significantly next year, he's done. It's Oklahoma, man. Like, they don't wait around. They're not satisfied with being, a 7-win team in the SEC. That's just not their standard. So I hate them. I hate them, but that's not Oklahoma's standard. No matter how much you hate them, like, they have higher standards than that.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on. Oregon and Ohio State. How much of the game did you watch, and what were your takeaways?
Well, I went back and watched it this afternoon. Um, I I think the big takeaway to me is those were two evenly matched teams on the field yesterday. Like no matter what the result ended up being, I think there's a very high chance that those two teams end up playing again,
Yeah,
whether it be in the playoff or
yeah,
even in the Big Ten championship game. I really do believe that. And I think, honestly, despite Ohio State losing, I think Ohio State impressed me with how they played. I thought, like, the things that they had been talking about in the offseason with trying to be more physical, trying to have that different mentality to kind of match Michigan. I think those things showed up on the field. Now, it didn't end up ending up like in a win, obviously, which is unfortunate for them. But I do think there's a lot of positives you can take away if you're an Ohio State fan. Now, for Oregon, though, Dylan Gabriel has some Brock Purdy in him. Are you kind of with me on that? Like, kind of just like slippery, not like insanely fast, but
yeah,
fast enough kind of
yeah.
vibes to him. Like, I don't know. I didn't know what to expect with him going to Oregon, but I think his ability to get the ball out on time to these fast wide receivers that Oregon always tends to have. I mean, it was electric yesterday. I mean, um, obviously it was a back and forth football game, but it just kind of felt like Dylan Gabriel made all the plays that were needed, whether it be third downs, whether it be um, just with his legs, extending plays, just all of it. He was just the guy making the plays. Um, now, I think to answer the question, like the final part of this question is like, after this game, is Dylan Gabriel the Heisman Trophy like favorite right now? He might be
No, no, he's not, but he's in the conversation.
one of the
Because,
favorites. Yeah.
because Ashton Genty at Boise State is incredible. Travis Hunter is absolutely incredible. There are there are other front runners, but with that performance yesterday, he is in the top five, no doubt about it. Because he was really good yesterday, and he looked like a quarterback that was making his 55th career start in college. Um, the experience in big games against, I mean, look, like 23 to 34, 340 yards, two touchdowns, no picks. I think he scored another rushing touchdown to go along with it. Uh, and Oregon was hitting on explosive pass plays down the football field. He was making the plays down the field, impact plays in this game against a good Ohio State defense. Uh, he connected on five pass plays of 25 plus yards. Those are the kind of explosive plays that you need against a team like Ohio State. Um, and in the fourth quarter, he had a 27-yard touchdown run and led his team to a go ahead field goal attempt, which they made with a minute 47 left. And if you look at the span of Dylan Gabriel's career, going all the way back to that horrific leg injury that he had at UCF, he now ranks third on the FBS career passing yards leaderboard with almost 17,000 passing yards at the college level. He's a 6-year senior. Rarely, up until like maybe last year and into this year, has he gotten his name mentioned in like amongst the top quarterbacks in the sport. But given the stakes of this stage, this felt like a transformative performance for this Oregon program. It kind of felt like a performance a la Washington's quarterback Michael Penix Jr. last year in that mid-October Washington Oregon Classic that we saw. Great job by Dylan Gabriel. And look, Oregon's got playmakers. I thought Jordan James, their running back, ran the ball really well yesterday. I was surprised how effectively this Oregon offensive line dealt with the Ohio State defensive front. With all that returning talent on that Ohio State defensive front, I largely think that Oregon's offensive line, which has been criticized some this year for some of their struggles early on in the season, which is why Oregon had some close calls to a large extent earlier on in the season. They weren't playing as well as we thought they would. This offensive line has some injuries, but I thought largely, like, if they didn't win the battle on that side of the ball, they largely neutralized the Ohio State defensive front, and Jordan James, their running back, was big time. And I largely thought, like, while Ohio State did impress me, like, they should definitely still be a top 5 team, I was surprised at some of the struggles that Ohio State had. For all that talent on the defensive side of the football, I was surprised at some of the big plays they were giving up, some of the key third downs they were giving up. But I think a lot of the credit also goes to the Oregon coaching staff for the game plan that they had instilled. Largely, I thought Will Howard played a pretty good football game. When you look at his final numbers, I think he ended up, no interceptions, 28 of 35, 326 yards, 2 touchdowns. And ultimately, one of the questions I had going into this game was, are we going to learn that Will Howard is a good enough quarterback? Like, will we learn that Will Howard's a good enough quarterback to win a national championship? Because that's ultimately the end-all, be-all goal for the Ohio State program. And he had a great game. Jeremiah Smith was involved, 9 catches, 100 yards, and a touchdown. It's really between him and Ryan Williams at Alabama for, like, the best wide receiver. Maybe not only freshman wide receiver, but maybe just wide receiver period in America right now. And Emeka Egbuka, who's been there quite a while, he's the veteran in the group, 10 catches, 93 yards, and a touchdown. Like, those 2 guys were great, but ultimately what this came down to was Ohio State had a chance to win. I thought the running back showed up. The running back tandem that they have showed up. Their offense played well for much of the game. They were answering Oregon when they scored on the road in a tough environment. But Will Howard's composure on the Buckeyes' final drive where they were trying to get into field goal range, and Howard takes a much, much maligned sack and then ultimately doesn't get down in time to call the timeout to line up for a game-winning field goal and time runs out. Like, that was kind of concerning. But it's not something we haven't seen before from Will Howard, when he kind of lost his composure last year against Texas when they had a chance to win that game in overtime. So I largely, like, these teams will probably meet again, but it's no sure thing because Penn State is lurking. And they had a big win against USC yesterday. So let's just go ahead and talk about that. Did you see the game? And if so, what did you think?
Well, before we do, we are at the 34-minute mark, and our plan was to kind of go 8 minutes each, like,
yeah, I realized that
game-wise. And then obviously the Texas game went a little long. So, like,
I have a plan for it.
What are you thinking in terms of?
I have a plan for it. Don't worry. But let's just get through these games, and then we'll discuss that.
Gotcha.
Penn State, USC. What'd you think? Penn State came back. Gutsy performance all the way across the country.
Yeah, the amount of travel that Penn State had to do for this game, I think the strangeness of it really showed up in that first half. I think Penn State, they came out a little bit flat, and USC took advantage. You got to give them credit for that. And I also think USC, showed that they're not quite there yet. I think all the things that we thought after week 1 and week 2 are true. They did improve on defense. They are a good team. But in order to beat a Penn State, in order to beat a Michigan, you have to have that extra level of physicality in order to finish off a football game. And I thought that was the part that was missing for them in this game. Like just the ability to just run the football consistently and not have to do all this window dressing, all this motion. Just run it down their throat and end the game. And they couldn't do that. And sometimes that's all there really is to it.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think this showed a lot about the character of this Penn State team. Look, they had a couple turnovers early. Drew Aller threw a couple interceptions. They weren't really clicking offensively. Ultimately, that's a credit to USC. But in that second half, it was a gutsy performance by Drew Aller, who I thought played really well in the second half, well enough for them to win the game. And ultimately, in overtime, they came out with the win. This is a big win for this Penn State program. And James Franklin, their head coach. I think when you look at the identity of this Penn State team, they don't really have a true number one playmaker at the wide receiver position. But what they do have is a great tight end who had a fantastic game of his life kind of performance yesterday. Was the best player on the field for most of it. And a great tandem of running backs who they can rely on, in Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, who are both really, really good. And both were really good yesterday. Ultimately, though, this was all just about proving to the nation that against a, what would you call USC right now? They're kind of just like an average Big Ten team. They
slightly above average,
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
They showed a lot of character yesterday, and they deserve to be ranked in the top 10. Like Drew Aller, I think finishes over 300 yards, a couple touchdowns, making plays with his legs outside the pocket.
Yeah, he impressed yesterday for sure.
He really impressed. Like there's something there from an NFL standpoint.
Yeah.
With his size and stuff and his arm strength.
I was just about to say that.
He was really good. And if you're Penn State, that's what you need. And it's good to feel like this is a Penn State offense or a Penn State team that can come back from those kinds of deficits. Because if you just looked on the surface and you just looked at it on paper, going into this game, I wasn't sure. Once they fell down 17-3, I wasn't sure if Penn State for sure was going to be able to overcome that on the road, all the way across the country. It's just a tough environment, right, in the Coliseum. But credit to them, man. They did it, and I don't know the Penn State schedule, but I am actually interested in pulling it up, if you don't mind, so we can kind of go through this, because I think it's a 3-team race right now in the Big Ten between Oregon and Ohio State, who just played each other, and then Penn State. Let me real quick, I have it right here, the Penn State schedule. So if you look at Penn State's remaining schedule, they have a bye next week. Okay? They come off the bye, they got to go to Wisconsin. They should win that game. And then after that game is the game, which I think could determine whether or not we see Penn State in the Big Ten Championship. They play Ohio State in Happy Valley at home. That is one of the biggest games remaining of this entire season. Because that's the biggest game left on their schedule. And then it's Washington at home, Purdue, who's 1-5, they're terrible, Minnesota, and Maryland. All games that they should win. Now, in this college football season, as we've seen, anything can happen. I'm not saying that it's impossible that Penn State might slip up in one of those games. But if they are truly the number 3 team in the country, and they are truly a college football, maybe even a national championship contender, they will take care of business for much of the rest of the schedule. The one question is, and the one question has been, can they beat the team in Columbus? They don't play the team in Ann Arbor this year. They probably wish they did because Michigan isn't very good. But they get them at home. So that'll be a whiteout game if I had to guess. That'll be a primetime game, beginning of November. That's the game, basically, of the season outside of this week. Like, that's the game that I'm looking forward to the most. All right. We've done 40 minutes already, but I'm okay with that because ultimately, like, let's be honest with ourselves, this was one of the best weeks we're going to get in the regular season of college football.
100%.
And, like, that's not to say we're not going to get a ton of good weeks moving forward. This weekend's going to be insanely awesome. Maybe not in terms of the volume of games that we had this past weekend, but there are 2 games that I think will both be absolutely fantastic. One including Texas in Austin against Georgia. Biggest game of the regular season for the Longhorns, outside of the game that will end their season in College Station. Let's talk about Ole Miss LSU. Let's see where we're at, and then we can rethink the back half of the show. Ole Miss and LSU. LSU walks it off in overtime. They did not lead for a single second in this game until they scored the walk-off touchdown in overtime to win it. Touchdown pass to Kyron Lacey down the right sideline by Garrett Nussmeier. Real quick, your overall takeaways from this game, which puts Ole Miss not only at 2 losses, but 2 conference losses, and knocks them to 5-2 in the season, and puts LSU at, I think it's 5-1 on the season, with 0 conference losses. They are undefeated in conference play, along with 2 other teams, Texas A&M and Texas. What are your overall takeaways?
Well, I think I don't know what it is about Ole Miss. I think part of it could just be it's transfer portal type of stuff, just not a whole ton of cohesion as a football team, maybe. I don't know if it's that. I don't know if it's whatever the case is. I think the takeaway is just that I think the Ole Miss defense ended up being quite a bit worse than what we were, looking at them as prior to the season. Now, obviously the offense is not perfect either, but you look at the changes they made on the defensive side of the ball, the guys that they brought in. They brought in Walter Nolan, like the 5-star guy from that 2022, well, one of the 5-star guys from the 2022 A&M class that they had. He has been really good, but overall as a defense, it just hasn't been there. Just too many big plays given up, too many, third down conversions given up. It just seems like they can't really get off the field on key moments. So I think we'll talk about, like, I guess where Ole Miss goes from here later on, but I think that's the takeaway to me.
Yeah, I think yesterday shows why, for Ole Miss, from an Ole Miss standpoint, like, that Kentucky loss is pretty costly because it takes away a lot of your wiggle room. And now that you lose this game to Ole Miss,
You got to win out.
you have to win out. And you still got to play Georgia. So it's no guarantee that you win out. And I don't even know, like, the rest of their schedule. They could have a couple landmine kind of games left. But the bottom line here is, I think for LSU, here's how I'll put it. right now, I think there are teams that there are really, really good teams like Oregon, Texas, Penn State, Ohio State. I think I'd put maybe even, I don't know that I'd put Georgia in this category quite yet, just because I don't know that Georgia's looked all that great so far this
Yeah,
season.
I think I would agree with
Um,
that.
that's probably like the tier one cutoff for me. And then there, like the rest of the teams in the top 10, they all feel flawed to a certain extent. Like they're all good teams. They're all pretty good teams. They're all worthy of being in the playoff conversation. But at this point in the season, they all have their flaws. Um, and for LSU now being ranked in the top 10, like it's great. You've now kind of righted the ship from that early season loss to USC. And if you had won that game, you'd be sitting here at 6-0. But you're undefeated in the SEC. And under Brian Kelly, you still haven't lost a night game in Death Valley. So you can definitely hang your hat on that. And I thought that environment was incredible last night. I mean, what else do you really expect from uh, Death Valley? It's Death Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, it's where dreams come to die, and Ole Miss's dreams died yesterday in overtime. But what I mean by that is like Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State, Penn State, they could all have flaws that just haven't been exposed yet. We haven't seen it though. With Alabama, their defense, pretty concerning at this point. Um, with LSU, they can't run the football. They can't sustain like an effective run game throughout. But I will give them this, like that offensive line, which was expected to be one of the best offensive lines in college football this season, which gave a lot of people hope about LSU coming into the season and their ability to compete at the highest level in the SEC. 0 sacks given up yesterday. Fantastic performance from a pass blocking standpoint. And I like the way that they attacked downfield. It felt like early on this season they weren't really getting plays down the field, a lot of explosive plays through the air. But they have to have that because they're really struggling to run the football. They're not really playing complementary offense. They didn't really lead yesterday, as I mentioned, until the last ultimately play of the game. But I thought guys like Kyron Lacey and CJ Daniels really stepped up yesterday. And ultimately, Garrett Nussmeier did it when it mattered the most. And I think right now, if I had to rank the quarterbacks in the SEC, he's probably close to my top 5. He might be in my top 5 because I think he showed more than Connor Wigman has at this moment in time, just from a sample size standpoint. Even though if Connor Wigman plays like he did against Missouri the rest of the season, he will be right back where we thought he might be able to be at the beginning of the season.
Right.
And LSU defensively, I thought the coaching staff did a very good job squeezing every bit of life that they could, or every bit of potential that they could out of LSU's defense yesterday. You're down Harold Perkins Jr. You're down probably your best athlete in your front 7. And I thought largely from an LSU standpoint, and they still have a long way to go, but I thought they tackled pretty well in space against these Ole Miss playmakers. And I was pretty impressed with the resolve that they had in this game to win this game. And now you sit at 2-0 in the SEC, I think it is. Might be 3-0. I don't know exactly. But they're one of 3 teams unbeaten in conference play. And they have a massive game in a couple weeks against Texas A&M. So we'll see where the LSU season goes from here. But if you're Ole Miss, you're in pretty deep waters right now with what you're going to have to do to be able to keep yourself in it for the college football playoff. And I don't want to say that a 3-loss team ultimately is like if they get to 3 losses, I don't want to say that they're totally out just because of the carnage that some of the carnage we're seeing in the SEC this year, but it definitely takes you out of Atlanta. And coming into the season, like this was an Ole Miss team that was expected to be in contention to play for the SEC championship and be in the playoff, but play for an SEC championship. And right now, they're not anywhere close to that. So I know they were missing Trey Harris yesterday, who's their best playmaker, but injuries happen, and the best teams overcome injuries. Isaiah Bond went out of the game yesterday, and from a Texas offense standpoint, like nobody cared, much less noticed. Like it was the same, the depth of talent. I don't know that it's there because Ole Miss doesn't ultimately recruit the same way that these elite programs do. They've done a good job through the portal. They've gotten good players through the portal, but this is why recruiting is so important because Ole Miss doesn't have the luxury of, okay, Trey Harris goes down, let's just bring in Ryan Wingo. We'll be all right. Like, they just don't have that. They don't have those kinds of players in their pipeline. So that's the difference right now between Alabama. They don't have a freshman like Ryan Williams. So it's just, look, I think the most interesting storyline right now is if Ole Miss, and Josh Pate brought this up tonight on his show, if Ole Miss, say they lose to Georgia, they're a 3-loss team. Say they're not somehow a playoff team at the end of the season. Could be. Definitely still could be. They have the team potential to be that. And I think they do get Georgia at home, which is better than on the road, I guess. But say they're not, and that Florida job opens. I'm just saying. I don't think it's impossible that that's a scenario that unfolds at this point. I don't know that Lane takes that job, but it's going to be talked about. It will definitely be talked about if that scenario ends up playing out. All right. Anything else from a college football standpoint yesterday? Tennessee beats Florida. Alabama squeaks by South Carolina. Trying to think of other significant results. The Big 12 is just an absolute mess right now. BYU is undefeated. Arizona State is unexpectedly 5-1. Kenny Dillingham's doing a great job with that program. K-State, they had that one bad loss to BYU, but they beat Colorado yesterday.
University of the Dallas Cowboys.
A couple teams that, excuse me, a couple teams that we expected to be in Big 12 championship contention, like Oklahoma State, are just not good this year. So, anything else from a college football SEC standpoint before we rethink things and possibly wrap this thing up?
Shout out to Vanderbilt, another tough win yesterday.
Absolutely, yes. I'm not getting ahead. I take this thing 1 week at a time. I'm celebrating beating Oklahoma, of course. Anytime you can beat Oklahoma, it's awesome. Yeah. Win a rivalry game by that margin is fantastic. It has to be celebrated. I'll probably turn my attention to Georgia starting tomorrow. It's Georgia week. We'll be previewing that game extensively on Thursday night's episode, along with Alabama and Tennessee. And the reason that game's interesting is because the loser of that game has 2 losses in conference. And from a race to get to Atlanta and play for the SEC championship game standpoint, that puts you kind of behind the pack so to speak, behind the line of scrimmage. You're set behind the chains from a getting back in the SEC championship race. And the reason that matters is because the winner of the SEC championship gets a top 4 seed and probably the top seed when it's all said and done in the college football playoff. So right now, if you're a Texas fan, here's what I'll tell you. The next 2 weeks will tell us a lot about this team because I think you can make an argument that in the next 2 weeks, Texas will see the 2 best quarterbacks it will play all season in Carson Beck and Diego Pavia. Maybe Connor Weigman, right, at the end of the season, but have not seen enough sample size from Connor Weigman to say for sure that that's the case. But yeah, we're going to find out even more about this Texas team moving forward. But right now, like, they are the rightful number 1 team in the country. And so we'll get more into week 8 in college football then. We had planned, right, Emmy? We had planned some college basketball for tonight, but we're not going to get to that because if we do, this will be an hour 45-minute episode, which I don't want to happen. So we're not going to get to that. We're not. Here's what we'll do. We'll put our schedule for this week, probably tomorrow or Tuesday, and how we're going to be doing the college basketball stuff on our social media. And we'll rethink things once we get out of here. Any parting shots before we sign off?
My parting shot is prayers for Aiden Hutchinson. Hope he gets better soon. It's a full recovery. That was a scary injury. I didn't even see the replay. They didn't even show it, so I'm probably not even going to look it up because
you don't want.
Believe me, so.
I saw the picture of it. Nope, don't do it. It is a broken tibia. I think that they said he had.
So it's the Alex Smith injury then.
I don't know how they compare, but it's probably something similar. He had, I think, immediate surgery at a hospital in Dallas, and he's going to be down for a while. They haven't really released the exact timeline, but yes, for sure. Like, that's a big loss for Detroit. They got a big win today, but that's a big loss for Detroit. We'll talk more about that on Tuesday, because I'm sure the Lions will be pretty high in both of our power rankings.
Yep.
I guess my parting shot. What would my parting shot be? Boy, I would just say I talked to you about this earlier today. I'm really excited about the next month or two in sports. The NBA's coming back in 2 weeks. That's really exciting. I've been getting
came through fast. Like, holy crap.
I've been getting pretty horny. I told you this earlier for the NBA to return.
Words is crazy.
And then, like, you have the NLCS, the ALCS, the Yankees are in the thick of things. The NFL is going into mid-October, November. We're getting into, like, big-time college football. This is the best time of year on this podcast, so stay tuned for all of our content. We greatly appreciate it. But until, actually, tomorrow night, where I'll be doing some content. And then Tuesday night, where we'll do our NFL Power Rankings, and ultimately the rest of the week. I am Michael Ween. He's Emmy Nixon. We are deep in the heart of Longhorn sports. Hook 'em horns. OU sucks, as always. And we are out.
What time is it? 10:21?
Yes.
OU still sucks.
It's 10:21, and OU still sucks. How do you end this thing?